Our second text this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 15. Listen once more for the word of God. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out at about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired at about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I gave to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or is your eye evil because I am generous?" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I am going to give y'all four words that begin a million stories. And I want you to tell me, or imagine, as it were, because I know that y'all aren't the shouting type. I want you to tell me how any one of those million stories ends. Ready? 4 words. You probably already know what they are. They're the whole entire sermon series that we're in the middle of. What are those words? Once upon a time. Okay, you've got the 4 words. How does that story end? I'll give you a hint. Okay? We're playing a game of, what is it, categories? I don't even know. 6 words. First word, conjunction. You got it? Do you know how that story ends? The one that begins, once upon a time? Y'all are so smart. And they lived happily ever after. Cinderella, the 3 little pigs, the gingerbread man, they all lived happily ever after. And even when the story doesn't end with those famous last words, thanks to Disney Animation Studios, the sense of the ending remains. The Little Mermaid, The Lion King, and my all-time favorite, Aladdin, each end with beloved characters, overcoming second act adversity, defeating evil, and riding off into the sunset of forever happily ever after. For my 8th birthday, I was gifted 5 copies of Aladdin from 5 different people. And you might think that we returned 4 of those for cash. You might think that that would have been smart, but my parents had the sense to know that I was going to burn through each, scratch the VHS beyond recognition, and that is exactly what I did. I must have watched Aladdin 10 times a week. The music entranced me, the sheer force of Robin Williams' genius, the unstoppable romance between Jasmine and Aladdin, and the sense of relief, the tremendous sense of relief when, despite Jafar's nefarious plans, the boy gets the girl, ascends to the throne, and the 2 live happily ever after. Outside the walls of my home, the tumult of a decade raged. Desert storm, a nebulous economy, the crisis of AIDS and its attendant culture wars. But in my den, with my little VHS tapes, order prevailed and all the world was happily ever after. In some ways, Matthew's parables unfold like fairy tales. Most often, and this is one of their most common connections, most often they begin with words that are unique to Matthew's gospel. The kingdom of heaven is like. You know you're in for a treat when you hear that. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, a grain of mustard seed, a net that gathers fish, a woman who lost a coin, and a merchant in search of fine pearls. All of those kingdom stories that Matthew tells remember well in me. And if you know them, they probably remember well in you too. They make sense. They offer some comfort. There is no faith too small, no coin left behind to collect dust. In that way, they remind me of fairy tales. All's well that ends well. But today, the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who gathers workers and then pays all of the Johnny-come-latelys the same wage as those who labored under the heat of the day, those from whom grime and sweat dripped into the fertile soil. Today, the kingdom of heaven is like a man given $500 just for showing up, while another, back aching, clothes torn, gasping for air, is given the same. How does today's parable, if you're really being honest with yourself, how does today's parable make you feel? Does it make you feel warm or coddled or happily ever after? Or, like me, does it make you a bit annoyed, especially on behalf of the early crew? But of course, I'm getting ahead of myself. Today's parable can be separated into two segments: the laborers and the conflict. In the first, a householder arrives at market at 6 a.m. and hires a gaggle of workers. They agree on a specific wage. The Greek says a denarius, which most scholars believe could feed a family for somewhere between 3 and 6 days. Those workers set out to fulfill their obligation. But then, at 9 o'clock, something gets in the householder's craw and he decides to return to the market. There is no sense in the text that the vineyard was understaffed. No sense that there were not enough workers already there from the early crew. The landowner goes because he's free to go. And finding at the market some folks in search of work, he returns to the field with a second brood of laborers, having agreed rather more vaguely to, quote, pay them what is right. Perhaps you don't find that odd. After all, what's the harm in hiring more workers while it is still early? But then at noon, with the day halfway over, he goes out again. And it doesn't stop there. At 3 o'clock, he returns to the market. To his delight, there are laborers there in search of work. Perhaps they had just arrived after a long day at another vineyard. Perhaps they had only just reached the market after a hard day of travel. Perhaps they were just in the right place at the right time. No matter why, they all agreed. Go with the householder. And they're taken to the vineyard, this time with no mention of payment. The householder seems to be acting on whimsy and impulse, especially when he returns at 5. By the time he brought the laborers from the 5 o'clock draw back to the vineyard, the day was done. They wouldn't have had time to break a sweat before they were all called together to receive their pay. The householder, a common image for God in Jewish folklore, seems motivated not by the needs of the vineyard, but by the desire to welcome more workers into the field. End this parable there, with the 5 o'clock crew just coming in, and you have yourself an uncomplicated, happy ever after. The kingdom of heaven is a place with enough room, enough work, enough space for more and more and more laborers. And God is the God who returns time and again, ensuring that no one, not one person, is left uninvited. That is a good, happily ever after. The problem, and this is often the problem, is that the bringing in of laborers, while a critical component of this parable and a vivid portrait of the God who welcomes, is not the whole story. There is more to be had, and this is where it starts to get a little bit dicey. The householder calls the manager to pay the laborers, insisting that he begin at the end, pay first those laborers, if you can even call them that, whose shirts were still crisp and brows were still dry. And when the manager pressed a denarius, which, remember, is the wage that first crew was promised, when he pressed a denarius into the palm of the last hired worker, I imagine the 6 o'clock crew beginning to stand up a little straighter, wiping the sweat from their brows, puffing up their chests as they anticipated their reward. If the 5 o'clock crew got a denarius for less than an hour, certainly the early crew would get 12, right? 12, nearly 2.5 months worth of provisions for their family. And that would be a fairy tale ending. The gospel writer doesn't tell us how the 5 o'clock cohort and then the 3 o'clock brood and the noon gaggle and the 9 o'clock caucus received their pay. I imagine with a little bit of confusion, right? Though certainly that must have given way to joyful disbelief. None had negotiated pay, and each was given more than they deserved. Finally, the manager pressed a denarius into the palm of the first worker hired. 1 coin. 12 hours under the hot Mediterranean sun, and he was paid the same as the guy who barely worked 15 minutes. How does this parable make you feel? Pay attention to that. It might betray something in you about how we all respond to the unmerited grace of God. Indeed, by this point in the story, there is a dawning realization. This parable is not only about God's graciousness in calling and providing. It is also, perhaps primarily, about how we respond to that grace. Not the grace that we are given. Of course, we are good with the grace that we are given. The grace given to those we think deserve none, or at least deserve less. We're talking about JV grace, B-team grace, C-team even. And how do you think the early crew responds? You have made them equal to us, the worker growls. He speaks with spite. But he's right, isn't he? The sting of this story is in the equalizing. They, who deserve nothing, or at least significantly less, are treated no differently than we, who labored all the day long. You have made them equal to us. Though spoken with a scoff, the laborer cuts to the very heart of the gospel, which we sing and proclaim week in and week out. But this time with flesh and bone implications. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we have been made equal to one another. The 6 o'clock crew, the 9 a.m. gaggle, the noon set, and all the rest. We are made equal. Not because we worked harder, not because God pities those who shows up late. No, because God is gracious. This one isn't about us. And God desires that no matter when we show up, no matter why we came late, no matter how it is that we are arriving, God desires that all of us and many more have the opportunity to labor in the vineyard of heaven. Here at Westminster, we seek to be a people of joy. It's one of our pillars that we've been talking about recently. We are joyful because God has called us, and we are grateful for that calling. This week, I have been thinking a lot about joy because it seems to be in short supply outside of these walls. We are greeted by a litany of dismay. Afghans, especially women and children, cowering in fear as the Taliban raises its flag. Families of slain service members taking on that tragic moniker, Gold Star. Pediatric ICUs overrun. COVID rampaging with no end in sight. A devastating hurricane affecting millions. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Joy, wrote Catholic theologian Pierre de Chardin, is the most infallible sign of the presence of God. Where is God in this moment in our lives together? What does this parable have to do with joy? And how can we be a people of joy amidst it all? Years ago, I read an interview given by Stephen Colbert to Oprah Winfrey. Colbert, recounting the tragedy of losing his father and two brothers in a plane crash when he was in elementary school, tells Oprah that he finds sustenance in his faith. Joy can be hard, Colbert notes. Joy is not the same thing as happiness. Happiness is overrated. Happiness can be really facile. Strange though it is, I think the early morning crew, the ones that we, or at least I, if I'm being honest, are most likely to sympathize with, can teach us something about joy in the kingdom of God. That crew, they saw firsthand, over and over and over, what it means to be welcomed by God. They themselves benefited from God's welcome. They were brought into the vineyard, but they grumbled. They grumbled when others were offered the same. It's easy to do grumbling. It's reasonable even. It's certainly a reasonable thing to do in our economy and in our world, just like it is easy to imagine the guilt that the noon crew, the 3 o'clock crew, the 5 o'clock crew felt when they received this unmerited gift of sustenance. But the grace we receive is not about the work that we fail to do or that we do. That is not how God measures our worth. Grace is about the God who calls us, all of us, to the vineyard and grants all equally the opportunity to labor in the upbuilding of God's kingdom. The grace of God, wrote Frederick Buechner, means something like, here is your life. You might never have been, but you are, because the party wouldn't have been complete without you. Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. I am with you. There is only one catch. Like any other gift, the gift of grace can only be yours if you reach out and take it. Maybe being able to reach out and take it is a gift too. I fear that we are sustaining ourselves as a Christian community on a frail, facile, fleeting view of the happy ever after when we are called instead to joy, to the joyful kingdom. The kingdom where lion and lamb will find rest together, where the 6 a.m. crew celebrates the good fortune of the late crowd. Make no mistake, God is not yet done with this kingdom. That's part of it. God is inviting us to be a part of it, to join in the labor, to join in the work. And there is work to do. And along the way, beautiful and terrible things will happen. But God, the householder, is with us still. Where is God in 2021? God is that householder, going out ahead of us over and over and over again to the point of absurdity. God is in the marketplace searching for whomever God can find. God is the one providing, whether we recognize it or not, for the first hired and the last. And God asks only that we take that provision, and in our living and in our working, we do the same. Lavish, absurd grace. Especially now. Especially today. Especially when the world outside these walls can seem so cruel. We are called to be a people of joy, not of grumbling. We are called to rejoice in the salvation, the finding, the reconciliation of all the rest. To celebrate the good fortune of a God who called us to be it all, of a God who comes looking, who is present in Afghanistan, presence in courts of justice even when injustice seems to prevail, present in ICUs and in the eye of a hurricane. We are called to imitate that God, so that even now we can go and search and pay lavishly and rejoice in the absurdity of having been at all and having the opportunity still to work the kingdom fields and to make this place and all of the places that we inhabit and we dwell a place of welcome. Make no mistake, hard work can be a gift of God. That's why we have this thing we call the Protestant work ethic. It can be a gift to work hard, to labor. It can be rewarding, but it is not that which will save us. The things we accrue are not God's grace to us. Just having been called, being here at all, is a gift of God. Whether you are a part of the early crew or you find yourself just having arrived at last call. The party is not complete without you. The kingdom is not complete without you. The denarius, which is sufficient, the denarius of grace can be yours. But you have to take it joyfully. And in that gift, there can be joy ever after. So we have to stop grumbling, y'all. We have to stop grumbling and we have to get to work. Take that denarius. There is more where it came from. And then, and finally, and forever, it will be joy ever after. Amen.